It's a great honor to be joined by Samuel Gregg. He is an affiliate scholar at the Acton Institute. How are you today, Samuel? And it's
I'm
great to
very
have you
well,
on.
thank you.
I should like to begin by asking you about the institute in which you are a part of, the Acton Institute. I understand that it is named after that British politician, Lord Acton, who is most famous for that phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, yeah.
The Acton Institute, of which I'm an affiliate scholar, has existed since 1990, and it focuses upon the relationship between liberty on the one hand and religion on the other. It's named after Lord Acton, who, of course, was the 19th century Catholic and liberal historian. And that very much reflects the inspiration of the Institute. It's interested in bringing together concerns about the free society, concerns about a society in which we have institutions of limited government, constitutionalism, free markets, a limited state, strong protections for private property, as well as a general sense that freedom is very important. But it seeks to bring together those concerns with the types of concerns that are reflected in, for example, Christianity. So a concern for truth, a concern for the importance of the virtues, a concern for the idea that there is a God and that that has implications for how we think about the nature of freedom, where freedom is directed, and how we use our freedom on a daily basis. So to do that, the Acton Institute engages in research. It also engages in programming, both in the United States and around the world. And it also has an extensive outreach in terms of communications, both in terms of social media, but also a very active web presence that makes the ideas of the Acton Institute more widely known to broader audiences and in a variety of languages, I should mention as well.
Mhm. I'd like to hear more about Lord Acton since I'm not too well versed about his political beliefs. But what I do know is that he comes from the what you call the Whig tradition of British politics. Other members of that particular tradition includes Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville, whose thoughts form basically the foundation of what we now know today as American conservatism.
Yes.
Nevertheless, is it in Britain is what you would characterize as liberal. So yeah, tell us about that.
So Lord Acton is, as I mentioned before, a 19th century historian. He also comes from an interesting background insofar as that he was a Catholic who came from a very devout Catholic family. And of course, Catholicism was very much a minority position in Britain at the time. And he was very interested in history. He studied under a man named Father Dollinger in Munich, who was one of the leading German historians of the time. And he was very interested in European politics. He was very interested in British politics. In fact, he lived most of his life in continental Europe and was born in continental Europe and spent some time in Britain, but was very much a person who moved very easily between national boundaries. He was very interested in the rise of what we call liberalism, classical liberalism as it's understood, the tradition associated with, as you mentioned, people like Edmund Burke, but also people like Adam Smith as well. And he was interested in how one can affect a type of reconciliation between, on the one hand, Catholicism, and on the other hand, the world of liberalism, or if you like, the world of religion on the one hand and the world of liberty on the other. And he was interested in this because, in the first place, these traditions had been in conflict in continental Europe for a long period of time. Liberty, the cause of liberty in continental Europe, was very much associated with the French Revolution. And as we all know, the French Revolution turned out to have a very nasty and antagonistic view of religion, most specifically Catholicism, and resulted in the persecution of the church, destruction of convents and monasteries, etc. And so the forces of the world of liberty and the world of Catholicism, these were seen at the time as being locked in a type of eternal conflict. Acton himself did not think that that was absolutely necessary. He believed that the best elements of what we're calling liberalism, so by which we mean things like constitutionally limited government, economic freedom, rule of law, property rights, limited state, etc. He believed that the ultimate roots of these things were to be found in the Christian tradition. Particularly the Catholic tradition, and even more so in the works of particular scholars, such as Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest theologian philosopher ever produced by the Catholic Church. And Acton was seen as one of these people who was trying to engage in this very difficult exercise of bringing these two forces, these two intellectual movements and social movements really, together into a more constructive dialogue by pointing out that what we understand to be, certainly what he understood to be classical liberalism, had these deeper religious roots that went back to the Middle Ages and even further. So he wrote two very important essays, among lots of other writings, one of which was called The History of Liberty in Christianity and The History of Liberty in Antiquity. Now, the history of liberty in antiquity was all about what he believed to be the ancient Greek and even Roman contribution to ideas of limited government, etc. But he also makes the point that the ancient world itself, because of its understanding of religion, because of its understanding of the nature of the state, couldn't quite make the leap towards the idea of limited government and constitutionalism because it saw the state as having the characteristics of a divinity. Mm-hmm. Lord Acton, in his essay, The History of Liberty in Christianity, pointed out that Christianity comes along and makes this vital contribution, which is to de-divinize the state, to say that the state is important, the state is significant, but it is not a god. And he traces this really, first of all, to the Jewish religion, but then he says in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, particularly when Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God. Those words, Lord Acton said, fundamentally de-divinized the state and opened up room for discussion about the state having limited powers, that the state could not behave as if it had godlike qualities, that there were real limits upon the extent and nature of state power. He also went on in later writings to point out how medieval Christianity developed very strong ideas about constitutionalism, how the medieval world was in many respects a much freer society than we often view it today. So this was his mission in life, to try and reconcile Catholicism and Christianity more broadly with the forces of what we would call liberalism. And it was a very difficult task because most people at the time saw these things as being certainly at some degree in conflict. And there were people on both sides who did not take a very pleasant view of people on the other side. So you can imagine that much of his life in the 19th century turned out to be a very difficult and even intellectually frustrating exercise because he was really pushing against many of the most powerful forces, both within the Catholic Church, but also in the world of liberalism at the same time.
I see. So that neatly brings us to what I can consider to be the Lord Acton of the 20th century and the subject of our conversation today, the theologian and philosopher Michael Novak, whom you have learned a lot from and were a personal friend of yours. So do you recall the last conversation that you had with Professor Novak?
Well, I had many conversations with Professor Novak not long before he died in 2017. But I think it's fair to say that there were two things that were on his mind. One was the persistence of hostility and even disdain among many religious believers for the market economy and capitalism. So Michael Novak is probably most famous today for a book he wrote in 1982 called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, in which he tries to trace what he calls the anti-capitalist prejudice among Jews and Christians generally, in which he tries to explore the roots of this tradition and then to try and show, if you like, how the forces of freedom, certainly economic freedom, that we associate with the economic system that first began emerging in its full, mature, modern form at the end of the 18th century that we call capitalism, with the world of faith, particularly with the world of Christianity, and even more particularly with the world of Catholicism. So that was his major concern. And at the time when he wrote that book, which came out in 1982, it was a very controversial book because it was challenging many established orthodoxies in the minds of people on the right and on the left, among Catholics and among non-Catholics when it came to thinking about the economy and capitalism. And it's very much, I think, thanks to his work that a much more constructive discussion between those who are believers and those who are people who take the market seriously really started to emerge. And I think that he had a great role in really forging that discussion, making it much more productive. And ultimately, I think many of his ideas were reflected in the 1991 social encyclical written by John Paul II, Centésimos Annos, which means 100 years, which is very much Pope John Paul II's reflections upon the type of political, cultural, and economic systems that would emerge after 1989. And it's very clear that Novak's ideas had a certain impact upon at least the economic dimension of that encyclical, which had a very favorable view of markets and limited government and culture, but also some of these other things that Novak talked about, that a free economy, capitalist economy needed to be embedded within a particular type of cultural framework. Now, towards the end of his life, Professor Novak, I think it's fair to say, and he intimated this to me in many conversations before he died, that there was slippage in the sense that the arguments about religion on the one hand and market economies on the other were starting to reemerge, that we were starting to re-engage some of these old arguments. And he made the point to me many times that in the end, there's no such thing as a sort of decisive intellectual victory, that you need to keep going back to these discussions. You're going to inevitably have these discussions every 50 years or so, because many of the problems, many of the questions come up with every new generation. He said to me on many occasions, we're going to have to go through the exercise of explaining to religious believers the importance of free markets and why they're ultimately compatible, if they're set within the right political and cultural settings, with the best instincts and insights that are brought to the discussion by religious believers.
I see. And I should thank Matthew Continetti of the American Enterprise Institute for introducing me to Michael Novak, as well as introducing me to you. I had him on the show recently, and he said that you were a great expert to talk about in regards to Michael Novak. And what captivated me about, Matt wrote this in his monumental work, The Right, that Novak was one of those thinkers who, perhaps the rare sort, that manages to reconcile faith and, in particular, Catholicism with the free market. Now, of course, I'm a recent convert to the faith, and I can tell that in Scripture there is a passage where Jesus enters the temple, and then he finds a group of merchants and sellers and currency exchangers, and he was enraged, and that was probably the only time that we see Christ really angry. And he said that, well, you're turning my father's house into a den of thieves. So perceivably, those who read it at first glance may thought of Jesus as a very anti-commercialist man. And so Michael Novak, being a Catholic himself, how would he read and interpret that particular passage?
Well, it's important, I think, to say that Michael Novak and many other theologians would look at that particular scriptural incident, let's call it, and they would say the following things. First of all, there was a practical purpose for these merchants being there, because people coming to Jerusalem needed to engage in money exchanges. And the people who were coming to Jerusalem, for the most part, were Jewish pilgrims. They were coming to worship at the temple. And to do that, in many respects, they needed to make sacrifices, right? So they needed to change their money. And then they needed to buy things like doves or particular types of animals, like sheep, for example, to make the ritual sacrifices that were part and parcel of the Jewish tradition when it came to participation in temple worship. So the fact that they were there in itself is not the issue. The issue, it's very clear from reading the scriptures on about this particular incident, is that it was functioning very much primarily as a place in which people were engaging in commercial transactions. It's not that the commercial transactions in themselves are problematic. You can look at all through scripture, and there's nothing problematic. There's nothing inherently wrong with engaging in commercial exchanges. The problem was that this was happening inside the temple, which is a place in which the Jewish people came to worship the one true God. And it was very clear that this was not an appropriate place in which people should be engaging in these types of transactions. It's like if you walk inside a church today. We would be outraged if we saw people on the side engaging in commercial transactions that had actually nothing to do with what the purpose of a church would be. So that's the objection. The objection is not to commerce in itself. It's not even to money exchanges in itself. The objection is to bringing these types of things into a space, into a sacred space in which its focus is upon God rather than the things of this world. Because that was the purpose. One of the purposes of the temple was to provide a sacred space in which people could contemplate God undistracted by the things of this world. And that, I think, is what we understand is going on in the scriptures. Again, it's not about markets per se. It's not about commercial exchanges per se. It's about where you do these things. So if they had been outside the temple, this would not have been an issue. But because it was so inside the temple, and also because it's very clear that the merchants engaging in this activity had really lost sight of what their purpose was, that they were there to provide a service. They were there to provide a type of a service for those people coming to the temple from often thousands of miles away to worship and to engage in sacrifice. But it's very clear that the merchants had lost sight of that and were essentially engaging in an activity that had lost sight of the deeper purpose for which they existed and what their service existed. So I think that's the best way to understand it. It's not a gerrymand against business. It's not a gerrymand against commerce or market exchanges or even money. It's about where you do these things and the appropriateness or the lack of appropriateness about where you do these things and how you see them in relation to the worship of God.
Yes, and I think that brings us to the larger question of to what extent does morality, and in particular Christian morality, can involve itself in commerce and in the free market.
Mm-hmm.
You hear examples all the time of, you cannot sell a family member of yours into slavery in order to pay off a debt or stuff like that. So, capitalism, the free market, it is a very much motivated by the accumulation of profit, and it is, at first glance, a very rational and depersonalized activity.
Mm-hmm.
But Christianity, at its core, believes that we are all human beings, and therefore it is it can be a dehumanizing activity involving ourselves in such a hyper rational and depersonalized activity like that. It makes us not into human beings but consumers, and I think that is a criticism that I believe many of the I guess post-liberal integrationalists, Catholic
Integral.
right integralists, yes, it's voicing these days. So how would how would Michael Novak, and I believe his writings carry special relevance with this new integralist movement, how would he respond to their criticisms of the free market?
Well, he would have multiple criticisms. So let's start with from the perspective of history and tradition. He would point out that the deepest origins of what we understand markets and capitalism today, he would argue, and I think historically he's absolutely right about this, that the first system that we can recognizably call capitalist emerged in the medieval period. So this is, of course, an entirely Catholic world. It's a world in which Catholicism is simply the religion of everyone, at least in Western Europe at the time, apart, of course, obviously from the Jewish people. So he would point out that it's no coincidence that capitalism in this medieval form emerges at this particular period of time, because he would say that Christianity, with its emphasis upon the use of human reason, its emphasis upon creativity, its emphasis upon freedom, all these things, when translated into the economic sphere, tend to give you the institutions and habits that we associate with markets today. So rationality translates into some of the things that you just mentioned, engaging in impersonal exchanges, for example. He would point out that the creativity translates into a deep respect for entrepreneurship, which is absolutely essential for the driving of an economy. And he would also say that the emphasis that Christianity gives to freedom and the importance of making free choices is not somehow cordoned off from economic life, that it translates into a pretty strong commitment to the practices and institutions of economic liberty that are so essential for modern capitalism today, and was, of course, essential for medieval capitalism in his time. So that's the first thing he would say. The second thing he would say is that there's a tendency on the part of integralists to romanticize the world that existed before the emergence of modern capitalism, beginning really in the late 18th century. We need to remember that the pre-18th century world was one in which poverty was the norm for most people, in which things like lifespans were much more limited, in which people's health was something that simply couldn't be granted. People simply didn't, most people were dead by the age of 30. So he would point out that this romanticization of the world that existed before the emergence of modern capitalism is not true to history. It also is a world in which, economically speaking, there's just a lot less development. There's a lot more poverty. There's a lot more people living in circumstances that we would find degrading today. As part of that romanticism, he would say that there's a tendency to ignore the rigid social hierarchies that were associated with pre-18th century, this 18th century mercantilist world. Because you're talking about a world in which there's rigid social stratification between the aristocracy, what you might call the bourgeois or the middle class, as well as the vast majority of people who are either agricultural laborers or small-holding peasants. Social mobility in that world was extremely limited. And in that sense, it was unjust. Capitalism, he would argue, makes the decisive contribution to breaking down this type of social stratification, because in a capitalist world, in a commercial society, it doesn't matter whether you're an aristocrat or a peasant. It doesn't matter so much what your social origins are. If you're prepared to work, if you're prepared to take risks, if you are able and willing to accumulate capital, if you're willing to pursue certain moral virtues that are like courage, risk-taking, prudence, etc., which are very important for commercial success, it was an instance in which people could move beyond the circumstances in which they were born in. And that was much harder in the pre-capitalist world that existed from the 15th century up until the late 18th century. So he would say that markets and capitalism are vehicles for social progress, for social development, for the ability for people to use their talents and abilities in ways that were much less obvious in a pre-capitalist world. And he would also say that they tend to ignore the deep resonances between these emphasis upon creativity, for example, that we find in the scriptures, and the workings of a modern economy, because a modern capitalist economy is deeply dependent upon human creativity. And that resonates very much with the messages we find, for example, in the book of Genesis. Human beings are not called to sit around and do nothing. They're not called to basically sit there and just contemplate the world. The man, Adam, is called to go out and till the field, to be creative, to change the world. And this all exists. This is all in place before the fall, And I think that's very important. The other thing I would say that Michael Novak would respond to in terms of the integralists is that capitalism takes account of the reality of human sin, or what in the Catholic world we call, especially what in the Catholic world, what we call original sin, in a way that most other economic systems don't. So capitalism assumes that humans are fallible. Capitalism assumes that humans make mistakes. Capitalism assumes that there are things about the world that we need to be attentive to when we're thinking about questions of economic design. And if there's anything about capitalism, it pays attention to the fact of human frailty, human weakness, human fallibility, and it actually, in some respects, channels those weaknesses towards the realization of the common good. And this was, of course, one of the insights of Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith said that it's through people pursuing their self-interest, rightly understood, that's how they contribute to the building up of a better society, especially a better economy. So Michael Novak would point to these things and say, these are aspects of economic life that are underappreciated by integralists, but which also Catholics should be paying a lot of attention to, because they tell us some very important things about economic reality, which is part of that broader reality into which humans have been born.
To which many of the thoughtful integralists I've listened to can launch these in response. So first is the idea that, well, if you do pursue your self-interest, then no matter what virtues, Catholic virtues, you are encouraging in order to fulfill those self-interests, certain other virtues will be eroded. For example, if you do decide to follow your path and be make a more prosperous living, you would abandon the small town in which you were born into in order to move to a big city, in order to make a better life for yourself. And if multiple people do that, then we would create overpopulated big cities and a multitude of ghost towns all across, say, America, for example. Secondly, they would point to how our globalized world, we would be more than willing to buy products from, say, China, where the regime is more than checkered, if it means we get it for cheaper and maybe better quality than the same product that was made by our neighbor or our countrymen. So it's the severing of the personal or interpersonal ties, family, country, community, that the integralists are worried about if capitalism, particularly global capitalism, is promoted. So Michael Novak's response to them would be,
well, I think his response would be pretty much the same as mine. First of all, there's a tendency to romanticize small towns and agricultural societies. These things have their advantages. As you say, they're very interpersonal, that everyone knows each other, etc., which is all good, but they can also be narrowing, right? They can also restrict people's horizons. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's an element of liberty that's involved in this, and people working out what their vocation is. And so to say that, well, people maybe shouldn't be moving to big cities, they shouldn't be leaving their small town or their small community, well, I mean, I think that's basically asking people to say, well, we just want you to live in this set of circumstances in which you were born for the rest of your life, and perhaps restrain your freedom and your ambitions and maybe even your vocation in order to perpetuate a particular type of lifestyle. Well, that's asking a lot of a particular person who may be ambitious, who may have a vocation to be working in a particular type of industry or even a particular part of the country that they were not born into. So, in other words, they basically not only romanticize some of this particular type of lifestyle, but they also are calling upon people to deny, I think, an important aspect and consequence of the nature of being a free being, that you need to make free choices and decisions that may end up making you more mobile, making you move to different parts of the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think that needs to be said is that the idea that small town America and the types of communities that were associated with things like manufacturing in America, the idea that these things have just disappeared or gone away, well, it's simply not true. It's simply not true. Most of these manufacturing towns that of course experienced some significant disruption as a consequence of America engaging in free trade around the world, most of those communities have actually adapted. Now, it took time, it was difficult, and in many respects painful, but nonetheless, most of them have actually adapted and have become new and different and have different industries, but nonetheless are able to support their populations. And even many of the people in these cities and towns have actually become relatively prosperous again. When it comes to the trade issue, which is, of course, something that's on the minds of many American conservatives, for example, well, there's a number of things we need to think about. The reality of the relationship between America and China is that they are significant trading partners for the moment, but they are also rivals. They're great power rivals right now. That is very clear. So what's happened, of course, is that there were many people in the early 2000s who argued that China's integration into global markets would make it a freer, not just economically, but it would also encourage the development of political liberalization, right? Well, that hasn't turned out to be the case. We know that that's not the case, that China has not gone down that path, and even its economic liberalization has been relatively limited. So that's a reality check, I think, that many American conservatives are rightly pointing to. At the same time, we need to understand, Americans certainly need to understand, that China is a market of 1.4 billion people. To walk away from that market or force American businesses to walk away from that market could be very damaging to not just America, but many of the often blue-collar people who work in the types of industries which are exporting goods and services to China. So the challenge, I think, going forward, and I think Michael Novak would affirm this, is how does America have a relationship, a trade relationship with China that takes account of genuine national security concerns, but does not get America involved in a trade war with China? During the Trump administration, there was an attempt to engage in a type of trade war with China, and no one won. It was actually very damaging to the United States. It cost something like 70,000 American blue-collar jobs. So this trade war that was embarked upon to quote unquote protect American jobs ended up costing American jobs. So trade and foreign policy are two things that are very, very difficult to separate from each other because they've always been intimately linked to each other. You can't help but have foreign policy implications when you engage in trade with people from another country. But it should be, and I think Michael Novak would have affirmed this, it should be possible for the United States to engage in trade around the world, not just with China, but with lots of other countries, in a way that does not involve compromising American national security. It's hard, it's difficult, but nonetheless, I think he would argue, and I certainly argue, that it's achievable.
Mhm. And I like to segue into Michael Novak's other belief that he held throughout his life, which is a liberalism politically and economically. And I heard an interview which he did with Ben Wattenberg, in which he expressed his belief that if an authoritarian country allows a measure of economic freedom,
Mhm.
then it will eventually lead to that authoritarian country becoming liberal and democratic. He cited an example in South Korea, where it started out as a dictatorship,
Mhm.
and then with economic liberalization, it became a representative democracy. Of course, the example of China is a salient one because everyone, everyone at the time when Deng Xiaoping opened the market up would say that it would lead to further political freedom. But then Deng Xiaoping is also the same guy who did the '89 Tiananmen Square massacre.
Mhm.
And there are examples of countries like Singapore and Chile back in the day, and Cuba pre-Castro, where there was a great measure of economic freedom, but little to no political freedom. And they to the extent that they've managed to liberalize themselves politically, that is not too significant. So that is a claim by Michael Novak, which I'm still very skeptical of, especially because I'm living in Vietnam, where there is a significant measure of economic liberalization, but not much in terms of political. So is Michael Novak mistaken in this regard?
Well, I think that it's true to say that when you move in the direction of economic liberalization, that there are certain pressures to extend political liberalization, but it's not a necessary correlation. Now, as I mentioned before, when the United States in the late 1990s and early 2000s was debating whether it should assent to China entering the World Trade Organization, one of the arguments made by many people was that trade liberalization would encourage political liberalization in a country like China. So, but I think it's fair to say, and I've written this in many places, that was a miscalculation. Why was it a miscalculation? For a couple of reasons. One is it implies a certain degree of economic determinism, that if you move in one direction economically, you inevitably are going to end up with a freer society. That's an argument that was very much associated with Francis Fukuyama
Mhm.
and his book, The Last Man in the End of History, which basically argued that we're all going to end up with market economies and liberal democracy, etc. And that argument was very popular, and to a certain extent, I think Michael Novak followed through on that argument. But I think it's fair to say also that that has not turned out to be the case, that there are examples of countries that have economically liberalized and have ended up with a degree of political liberalization. You mentioned South Korea. Taiwan would be another example of such a country. But it's not necessary. It's not a rule. It's not a sort of deterministic exercise because, as you mentioned, there are examples of countries that have engaged in economic liberalization, but political liberalization has not necessarily taken place, or if it's taken place, it hasn't taken place to the extent that people envisaged. And China, of course, is the biggest example of that. So what I think people would point to here, and I think Michael Novak would do this today, is that they would point out that culture and political traditions are very powerful things. China does not have very much of a tradition of political freedom. Its political traditions are those of authoritarianism. It's not just that which we associate with the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Even before that, the Chinese political model was a highly authoritarian political system. That goes back to the emperors, the Manchu emperors, and all the dynasties before that, right? So this is by no means a society that has much experience or cultural roots in the traditions of democracy, constitutionalism, freedom, etc. So it seems to me that free marketers, and I'm very much a free marketer, one of the things they're going to have to think about is the relationship between free markets on the one hand and the power of culture, the power of tradition. Because It turns out that economics can push and shape culture in particular ways, but culture is a very, very strong thing, particularly in societies which tend to be monocultural in terms of their political history. It's not just China that's like this. Russia is very much a country like this as well. Russia has very, very little experience of what we would call liberal democracy. Maybe 10 or 12 months in the period immediately following the first Russian Revolution. But apart from that, its traditions are highly authoritarian, whether it's under the Tsars, whether it's under the Communist Party, Russian Communist Party, or whether it's under someone like Vladimir Putin today. So when we look at that, we realize, okay, free marketers have to be very, very careful before they start saying things like economic liberalization inevitably leads to political liberalization. The evidence is very clear that there is no necessary trajectory. It is the case that some countries that have embraced economic liberalization have eventually politically liberalized. But there's no inevitability about that. There's no inevitability that that will necessarily happen. If you look at the case of Chile, why did Chile embrace political liberty? It wasn't much to do with the economic liberalization. It was the fact that the regime had lost political support because it was seen as a highly illiberal authoritarian regime. And the military themselves decided it was time to give up power. They made that free choice. In the case of China, the Chinese Communist Party has made it very clear that they are not giving up power, that they are not in the business of trying to engage in any type of political liberalization. They are there to stay, and their position is very consistent with the trajectory of long-term Chinese political history. Now, the thing about Michael Novak was he took culture very seriously. So he said there's basically three systems. You've got the political system, the economic system, and the cultural system. And if you want to have a free society, all three things have to be more or less aligned around giving an importance to liberty, rule of law, constitutionalism. So you can have an economy that's relatively free, and that can exist within a culture that's relatively authoritarian and a political system that itself is also authoritarian. So it seems to me that Michael Novak would say, yes, this fits my tripartite model of society, and free marketers have to give some very serious thought as to the relationship between economic liberty and political liberty on the one hand. Economic liberty does not necessarily produce political liberty, and there's plenty of evidence that that is in fact the case. And indeed, the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, people like Adam Smith, who really is the intellectual genius who first formulated in a systematic form the case for capitalism, he didn't see any necessary connection between economic liberty and broader political liberalization more generally. He also saw no correlation between a commitment to free trade and peace between nations either. So there's a longer tradition of free market thinking about these issues, which I think free marketers today would be, I would encourage them to go back and learn some of these things about their own tradition, because it would lead them to not say things like economic liberty automatically produces political liberty. Adam Smith didn't believe that. David Hume didn't believe that. And I would argue the best free market thinkers have always understood that there's no necessary correlation.
Mhm. So that would bring us to the United States, a country that, as of right now, is both an economically liberal country and a politically liberal country. The degree to which both are, the degree to which they are liberal countries is still disputed, but I would argue that for now, they are both economically and politically liberal. And Michael Novak, from what I've read, really believe in the promise and the ideals of the American founding and its constitution. Nevertheless, it should be acknowledged that the philosopher whose thoughts influence the American founders the most, John Locke, in his essay concerning toleration, he excluded Catholics from the realm of toleration. He believed that a Catholic leader would not be a prince of his own country. Rather, he would take orders from the Vatican. And there has been a long history of anti-Catholicism in the United States, given that it was formed under a Protestant foundation. And it reaches all the way to Michael Novak's lifetime, arguably. I know that there was a huge controversy when John F. Kennedy was elected, because he was the first Catholic to be elected, and people were wondering whether he would be a governor of America or he would, take cues from the Pope. So, how would Professor Novak reconcile this, the high ideals of the American founding versus the perhaps a persistent failure of some of its best peoples to adhere to those sets of ideals?
Sure. So that's a really interesting area, which I've thought a lot about and written about as well as Michael Novak did. So a couple of things that I think are worth noting. First of all, there was always anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States. There still is, to a certain degree, a certain anti-Catholic sentiment. And the way that has manifested itself has been different. So, as you pointed out, John Locke, who was very influential on a number of thinkers, did not think that toleration should be extended to Catholics, because Catholics, he thought, had a divided allegiance between their country on the one hand and the papacy on the other. So he said, you can't have people with dual allegiances. You can't tolerate people like that. He also said you can't tolerate atheists, because he said atheists have there's nothing about atheism that provides them with the type of moral framework that you need to live in a free society. An atheist, he said, can have no objection to people doing evil things, right? So it wasn't just Catholics, it was atheists as well. When it came to the American founding period, it's certainly true that there was still a great deal of anti-Catholic prejudice in the early American colonies. In most states, Catholics were treated as second-class citizens. In many cases, even in a state like Maryland, which had been founded by Catholics, Catholics couldn't vote. There were restrictions on the degree to which they could politically participate. Even their economic participation in society was limited, and certainly the way that they engaged in their religious practice was restricted. The American founding in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution, however, really did move in the direction of ensuring that those political and legal and economic constraints on Catholics were removed. And that's very clear. So that's why people like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the richest man in America, but also a very devout Catholic, that's why he could sign the Declaration of Independence, because he recognized that this would achieve not just wider civil liberties and economic liberties for Catholics, it would also achieve a high degree actually, of religious liberty. So that is the context of the founding. And I think it's very clear that it did give Catholics full rights, if you like, to be American citizens in the same way that everyone else was an American citizen. Now, that didn't solve the problem immediately, obviously, of anti-Catholic prejudice. America was overwhelmingly a Protestant country. Most Protestants in America had a very negative view of Catholicism. So there was still a great deal of social discrimination, economic discrimination, etc. But it wasn't as if the system itself, the political system, was somehow institutionally geared to discriminate against Catholics. So that provided Catholics living in a majority Protestant country with the space and the freedom that they needed to be able to participate in politics, to participate in the economy, to participate in civil society in the same way that everyone else did. So the American founding, I think, was a very good thing for Catholics. Now, it doesn't resolve all the potential conflicts that can result as a consequence of Catholics believing certain things about society, politics, the economy, human life, etc., and the way that the political system deals with any number of questions. Simply to declare, for example, that people have religious liberty It doesn't answer all the questions about what those limits might be, what the limits to religious liberty might be when they come into conflict with other forms of liberty and other types of rights. But broadly speaking, I think the American experiment has been very good for American Catholics. It's provided them circumstances whereby, as you mentioned, we now have, we had the first Catholic president in 1960. That would have been unthinkable 20, 30 years before that. America today has a Catholic president. The real issue, I think, now facing Catholics in America is the degree to which they can participate in a society in which many of the major cultural institutions, I'm talking about universities, certain parts of civil society, even some parts of the business world, hold to values and convictions that clash with some pretty well-defined points when it comes to Catholic moral doctrine. So the abortion issue is the obvious one, right? That's the most obvious one, where there has been long conflict between, on the one hand, the dominant, let's call it secularist view of the world, and Catholic teaching about the sanctity of human life. But it's also now manifesting itself in terms of conflicts about religious liberty and what religious liberty actually means. And Catholics have a very robust, broad conception of what religious liberty is all about. It's not just me and my God and what goes on when I go to Mass. It's also about how I behave in the public square. And there are strong, let's call it secularist expectations that want to really confine and limit that space for religious liberty. So that's where I think some of the conflicts are now, at least between those people, those Catholics who take Catholic teaching very seriously, and what you might call secularist expectations. But the good thing about America is it gives us the institutional structures and political processes by which those types of debates can be carried out and engaged in without people actually killing each other. So Catholics are always going to have, whatever regime they live under, whatever political circumstances they find themselves in, there's always going to be a certain degree of tension between the demands of Catholic faith on the one hand and the demands of the political order on the other. And it doesn't matter whether the political order is authoritarian or what we might call liberal or corporatist or monarchical, there's always going to be a certain degree of tension. In monarchical systems, right, there was always tension between the degree to which Catholics owed allegiance to the king and the degree to which Catholics owed allegiance to Rome, to the Holy See. The same applies in authoritarian systems. The same applies in what you might call liberal systems. The beauty of liberal systems is it provides much more space and opportunity and structures whereby Catholics can present their view of what they think is important for the political order and can argue these things in a way that is less apparent in a monarchical regime or an authoritarian regime.
I'm glad you mentioned the secular impulse to, I guess, push to relegate religion to the private sphere instead of the public, because that's actually something that I wish to address in Michael Novak's thinking. These days I find that the conflicts are, at least within America, are not between those of different religions, but those with religions versus, again, the secular impulse to push it to the private sphere instead of the public. And we saw it all the time particularly, again, in the Supreme Court, where a Catholic associate justice or future associate justice would be asked whether or not she would govern according to her faith or to her constitution. This is it, obviously in direct reference to whether or not she would turn down Roe versus Wade, and that would be, the justice in question is Amy Coney Barrett, which I recall
Yes.
she did struck down the Roe v. Wade law. And of course, the controversy extends to perhaps as a culture, would Americans, tolerate let's say there's a Muslim president and he wishes that instead of swearing in on the Bible, he would place his right hand on the Quran. And so I predict that there will be a huge controversy regarding that. So, so to in the thinking of Michael Novak, how much should religion or one's religious faith play into political affairs or even public affairs in general?
Well, I think there's a number of ways that Michael Novak would approach that type of question, which I think is a very pertinent question for today's circumstances. But it's also his engagement with this question reflects what you might call the broader Catholic tradition of natural law thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and certainly this is what I would argue, when Catholics engage in the public square, whether it's about some of these controversial issues that you've already mentioned, or when it comes to shaping public policy about all sorts of issues, some of which are not particularly controversial, some of which are very controversial, that Catholics cannot be in the position of seeking to impose their religion on other people, specifically religious claims upon other people. Catholics can't be in the business of passing legislation, for example, that bans other religions or says everyone must attend a Catholic church on Sunday and everyone must participate in the Catholic mass, etc., etc. But when it comes to that, but those sorts of things are not really part of the discussion. The real question is how Catholics engage with some of these more commonplace, everyday, sometimes controversial public issues. And Michael Novak's position and my position and the position of a number of other, I think, leading Catholic thinkers in the world today would be that natural law is the way that you engage in these discussions, because natural law is about, remember, human reason, right reason. Natural law reflects the confidence that the human mind can know the truth, even unaided by divine revelation. You don't need to be a Catholic to understand the science of when human life begins. You don't need to be a Catholic to understand that there are certain limits about what government can do and what government shouldn't do. You don't need to be a Catholic to argue that constitutionalism and limited government are generally good things. Natural law provides you with all the resources that you need to do that, and you're doing it on the basis of reason. You're not making special religious claims. What you're doing is saying a person who believes in human reason, who takes natural law seriously, would come to these conclusions about these subjects. And at no point does that involve imposition of specifically religious claims upon other people. So that's, I think, Michael Novak would say Catholics should engage with these types of questions. So when I'm debating about any number of questions, public policy questions, economic questions, etc., if I'm talking to a non-Christian audience, I don't talk about God. I don't talk about scripture. I don't talk about the long tradition of Catholic moral and social reflection. I talk about natural law. I talk about what human reason demands of us when we engage and try and make decisions about controversial public policy questions, because reason is the common ground upon which all human beings presumably can agree, right? Because we're all human, and what defines us as human beings are two things. One is that we have reason, and the other is that we have free will. Without those things, we're animals, right? We're not special. We have reason, we have free will, animals, plants don't. So what that means is that the Catholic entering the public square to argue about things like wage levels, or whether the government should engage in a particular war, or whether constitutional rights mean certain things. My view is, and I'm very sure Michael Novak had the same view, that we should do so on the basis of natural law, not least because the person who believes themselves to be a convinced secularist, presumably they are entering the public square on the basis of reason as well. right? They're not making, they're not trying, they would say they're not trying to impose particular religious beliefs upon people. They would say, oh, we're just arguing on the basis of reason, to which my response is, great. Yes, let's absolutely have a discussion about what reason demands. And what's interesting, I think, is that natural law, which was very influential upon the American founding, I mean, it was simply part of the air that the founders breathed. They all believed to some degree in natural law. It turns out, I think, that those who take natural law seriously have a much richer, robust, dynamic, and convincing understanding of the nature of reason than secularists. Secularists tend to have a very instrumental understanding of reason. Reason is about how you do things, not why you do things. Natural law provides you with insights into how you do things, but it also explains why you should do certain things. So that's the last thing I'll say about this religious secular thing, is that secularists have their own specific religious understanding of the world, because no one really escapes from the demands of religion. We are all homo religiosos to some degree. The atheist, is a religious person insofar as that they have arrived at certain conclusions about the origins of the universe, about the question of whether there is a God. So they can't escape from religious claims. And if you look underneath many secularist claims, there's a type of religious framework at work, right? So I would say, even if you look at something, what's one of the most virulent forms of secularism would be Marxism, right? So Marxism certainly has a view of God. God doesn't exist. Religion's just the opium of the people. Marxism has its own sacred texts, works of Karl Marx, Lenin, etc. It has a hierarchy, a religious hierarchy. It's called the party. Mm-hmm. It has various saints, Che Guevara, etc., etc. So when you look at some of these things, you start to discover that many secularist positions are actually highly religious in the way that they understand the world. And it behooves Catholics engaged in the public square to point this out, that secularism is not, in fact, neutral, that secularism has a certain understanding of the world and a certain understanding of human beings that's just as debatable as the claims that Catholics bring to the public square when these issues are discussed.
Right. So, final question. I judge a thinker not in terms of how many people agrees with him, but to what extent has he shifted or shaped the public discussion about various important issues after his passing, or even within his lifetime. So my question to you is, how has Michael Novak shifted our discourse, political, religious, or otherwise?
Michael Novak, I think, did a number of things for the world of ideas that have persisted and lasted. The most obvious is in the world of economics. He provided, with his book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, and other books that elaborated, the articles that elaborated on that theme, he's really provided, if you like, maybe the strongest moral/cultural case for free markets and capitalism since Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And that, I think, is a pretty big achievement. So Michael Novak died in 2017. So it's, in a way, it's still too early to tell, right, how long his ideas will persist in shaping the public square. But what he did, I think, was to really show that it is possible to construct a moral and cultural argument for free markets and capitalism that goes way beyond the type of utilitarian arguments that you often hear free marketers articulating in favor of markets. There is a utilitarian argument for markets, and there are utilitarian dimensions to the argument for markets. But Michael Novak shows that the argument for moral and the moral and cultural foundations of markets goes way beyond utilitarianism, and that in the end, utilitarianism is not enough. It's not enough of a foundation for markets. You need deeper moral and cultural resources. And Michael Novak showed in his Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, in many of his subsequent writings, how you could do that. And that, I think, is maybe his biggest, most important legacy for the world today. The second thing I would say is that within the Catholic world, the Christian world, and even more specifically in the Catholic world, he provided, I think, the rest of the universal church with a particular appreciation of the significance of the United States and the American experiment in ordered liberty. He showed the rest of the Catholic world that this should not be dismissed as a purely Enlightenment, highly Protestant influenced experiment. That in fact, this experiment in ordered liberty has deep roots that go way back to the medieval period and even beyond. In many respects, Catholicism and its understanding of politics and the economy and culture has many resonances with the American experiment in ordered liberty and vice versa. So in that sense, I think he provided a universal lesson for the universal church about the importance of America and the importance of the American experiment in ordered liberty. But he also showed American Catholics, he showed them new ways in which they can engage with this founding, with the American founding and the American experiment in ordered liberty, that was far less apparent before he came on the scene in the 1960s and started, and particularly after the Spirit of Democratic Capitalism appeared in 1982, he really accelerated his arguments about that. And he showed that in so many respects, there are deep resonances between the church's rich moral, social, political, and economic insights and those of the American experiment in ordered liberty. And that, to that extent, I think that's going to be one of his major contributions to world Catholicism and American Catholicism in particular.
On that note, thank you very much, Dr. Samuel Gregg of the Acton Institute, for joining me on this very insightful and thought-provoking discussion on the late Michael Novak, philosopher, theologian, devout Catholic, and a defender of liberty. So again, I thank you for joining this program, and from one Catholic to another, may God be with you.
Thank you, and God be with you as well.